a couple of prayers, some opening verses, that kind of thing. We've used that time to introduce the kind of the theme of the day and what's going on in church, you know, and some of the things going on. So this morning, for those of you who are in there, learned a little bit of trivia. Where does the Hunchback of Notre Dame get his name from?
Notre Dame.
Well, he's found on the steps of Notre Dame, but what's the Hunchback's name? Quasimodo. Why is his name Quasimodo?
Because he was found on
the steps of Notre Dame Cathedral on Quasimodo Geniti Sunday, which is today. Okay? So, the Sunday after Easter is called Quasimodo Geniti Sunday. Every year. If you use the 1 year. Yeah. The traditional 1 year lectionary. And that comes from the opening words of the introit that we're going to sing today, like newborn infants. That's what Quasimodo Geniti means. In Latin, it's like newborn infants. Right? So you long for the pure spiritual milk of the Word. Okay? So, that's where the Hunchback gets his name from. Is he's found on the steps of the church on the Sunday after Easter, which is Quasimodo Geniti Sunday, so he just named him after the Sunday. Okay? So, that's, we've done that kind of stuff in our opening, introducing the theme and how some of these things kind of work together, both for the day as well as maybe for the season. Right? We've also looked at some of the hymns that we sing throughout. So sometimes, most notably, we typically look at the hymn of the day. So whichever one's kind of right in the middle of the service. Usually, not always, that one kind of matches up with what the sermon is going to be based on. Right? When I was doing those daily devotions and recording them a year ago, that was always what I did on Sunday, or Saturdays as well, was a similar little hymn study like that. We've also used that time to introduce some hymns that are more difficult or newer, so at least a small group of people have a trial run and can figure out some of the stuff. So, since you guys are here, and since you'll be next Sunday, you'll be in the church at 9 o'clock. What do you guys want to do when we get over there? Do you want to do like an introduction to the day? Do you want to do a hymn? Or is there something a little different? Or do you care?
Dealer's choice.
Dealer's choice? Okay.
It's not much.
All right, you asked for it.
We had our chance.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, we'll do something, and I'll just kind of think about it. Okay. So, of course, this, again, part of the purpose of this is, even though we're dividing up basically by age groups, right, and for Sunday school and Bible study, just to have this opening time with the short prayer and meditation on the Word of God, really, because, again, we're in different places of the church doing slightly different things, but we're all doing the same thing, really, right? We're gathered around the Word of God to study and to prayerfully ask that God would increase our understanding in His Word and our Christian lives and our faith in this time. So, yes, ma'am.
Could you explain what the offering plate that we're passing in here?
Okay.
What it's for?
Yeah, so I forgot about that too. So what we normally would do is we pass around, so we'll restart this today too, right? So an offering that we would take, sometimes we've done it in the opening, sometimes we just pass it around here, depending on if I remember or an elder remembers or just somebody else remembers and says, hey, we should do this. So what we decided years ago to do with this Sunday school offering is to use those funds to purchase primarily Bibles, catechisms, the Book of Concord, the Treasury of Daily Prayer, those sorts of resources. So some of them you have in this little bookcase over here. Not all of those are from there, but some are. So that's what the group had decided at that time to do with those funds. In part so that we can offer a little bit of a discounted price here than what you would if you would purchase some through Concordia Publishing House or Amazon or something. But also that way, if visitors or new people come to church, even our confirmation kids come, that we can say, here's a small catechism, right? Here's a Bible. You don't have to pay for it. This is a gift from our church to you, right? So that's typically what we've done for several years now for the Bible study offering, was to take that money and to apply it in that way. So I guess I'll ask, is that still agreeable? I mean, is that something you guys would like to continue?
Yeah.
All right.
And Pastor, a lot of times people have asked, if I buy a book, how do I pay for it? Well, we put it in.
Right. Right. So if you want to buy a book, and you can, and you'd like to, that's where you would put a check or cash or whatever is in the offering that gets passed right here. So then it gets just put back into that pot and then applied back to purchasing more. Okay? Yes, Mr. Treasurer.
There's kind of a familiar, but somebody slumped in back there in the corner.
I'm getting there.
Oh,
Wait.
okay, I'm sorry.
Wait for it.
Wait for it.
Wait for it. Yeah. So, okay, so that's that. Okay? So, yeah, somebody slunk in the corner. Just sitting right over here. Most of you, not everybody though, because we have some newer people in the last couple of years. But stand up. Yeah. This is people are going, why are you clapping for this strange night I've never seen? This is Nick Whitney, who's a child of the congregation, raised here, who is currently on his vicarage in Tennessee, right? And he came home. He was going to come home for a friend's wedding that, because of some of the COVID stuff, got changed. But he decided, I just want to come home anyway and see some family and friends. Leaving his wife and 2 children.
But she's holding up all right.
Yeah. So, Nick's a child of the congregation going through seminary. So he has about a little over a year, and he will be done.
Yeah,
Right?
almost
So
just about a year, actually.
almost. So in May, God willing, in May of 2022, he will graduate. April is usually when there's call day, and so unless he decides to continue on in his schooling in some way. Probably not. He's like, I'm done. So in April of next year is call day, and when they find out when or where they're going to be going. What we're going to do here, depending on who's around and what we want, that's usually during the week and in the evening. Now they're on Eastern time, so it's a little bit earlier for us. But we'll do a little watch party. So we'll come here at the church and we'll put it up on the television and we'll watch the whole church service, call service. They stream it all online, and that kind of thing.
No, actually over at Fort Wayne is actually at Eastern. Just barely.
Yeah. So, so we'll do that next year. We could do the same thing for graduation. The graduation is more the academic side of things, so it looks like it's wrapped into a church service. But call day is the real excitement. So that one we'll watch. We'll watch together for anybody who's interested, and we'll send out information if people can't come here, but they just want to watch on their own. They can do that at home as well, or later on. Right? So we'll keep you guys posted, but welcome.
Yes, it's good to be back.
Vicar.
It's good to see everyone.
Vicar, it's good to have you here.
Vicar is Latin for go do this.
Right. And so for those who aren't aware or just aren't all that familiar, so vicarage is basically an internship year, is what that is. So seminary, in our seminaries, it's a 4-year degree, 4-year master's degree. Typically the 3rd year is the vicarage. Nick did a little, it's not uncommon, but he started, or was doing a winter vicarage. So he started in the winter rather than in the fall. Okay, so he's going to go, you got there right the week of Thanksgiving or something.
Yeah,
that's
because
when you started.
Thanksgiving, my vicarage actually runs December 1 to December 1.
Okay.
So we'll kind of figure out when we get towards, closer towards that time, when I'll go back, because winter quarter will start actually a little bit before that.
Right.
So I'll have to coordinate with my supervisor, figure out when we'll, shoot the gap and kind of make our way back to Fort Wayne to finish up winter and spring quarter.
Right.
And like Ross said, God willing, I'll be able to get the rest of my classes jam-packed in those 2 quarters and get everything done.
Yeah. So several times in my doctoral studies, when I've had to go back to Fort Wayne, I stayed with Nick and his family, and then there's a time or two I didn't when you guys were there, and then you left. Now I'm in outdated dormitory rooms.
And you missed the food,
You know,
too.
bathrooms.
Missed the food?
Yes.
Yeah.
Last Mason, concrete block,
What was that?
in the dorms, concrete block, wall, like right behind you.
Yeah.
Just like that, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good kind of Lutheran monastery.
Monastery. Those are your Luther times.
It will be very humbling.
So, anyway, it's good to have you here just for a little bit. He heads back home tomorrow.
Yep, tomorrow morning, 7 in the morning, I have flight takes off.
So, sometimes in the past couple of years, if he's come back, he's participated in the service. But now that he's kind of doing that full time, it's nice just to sit back with his parents over there and get to go to church with his parents. All right. So after church, feel free to visit with him a little bit if you'd like.
Our little boy.
We do have a voters meeting. So the plan is that the voters meeting lasts a whopping 5 minutes.
Yes.
And then, that's my plan anyway. And then you can visit with the vicar. So, today, are there any other questions, anything else? Okay. So, this morning what we're going to kind of get back into is some more of this timeline stuff. Now, the books came in, the hardbound books came in. So they're sitting just right over here on the table. If you ordered one and would like to come pick yours up, please do so and just mark off on the paper that you picked it up. That way we can know. You guys are, not unsurprisingly, when we first passed around the sheet, I thought, there's some people who weren't here or were still thinking about it, so I'll order more. We ordered 20 extra copies, and I think they're all accounted for. So,
you order
hey, that's a good thing. Huh?
Are you ordering again?
We will order again if we need to. Yes. So, we have some softbound books and some hardbound. So if you order the hardbound ones, we might have some. We might have a couple of extra left over. Okay. So that's the plan. So the printout that I had given for the new one for today is just from that hardbound book with some information on there. But we're gonna so I'm gonna reference some of that here in a little bit. So if you don't have the book, you can get that printout that I did. But what we're going to look at today, over about the next 30-40 minutes, is really just a brief overview of the history and geography of what's called the divided kingdom. Okay? So that's where last time we met 2 weeks ago on Palm Sunday, we discussed a little bit of the timeline of King Saul and David and Solomon. Okay? So now we're getting into, again, what's called the divided kingdom. So the handout that I gave you the very first day, that has on the front page, that has kind of the whole timeline of the Old Testament really here. You can see near the end of the top column on the right hand side, you have the year 931, which is when the Jewish kingdom is divided into north, which is now called Israel, and the south, which is now going to be called Judah. Okay? So, the 12 tribes of Israel divide up into these two different kingdoms. Okay? And there's some sibling rivalry and squabbling that will now go on for a couple of hundred years. Okay? Which isn't anything new in the history of God's people, right? So you have Abraham's kids, right? Isaac and Ishmael, well, they like to bicker and squabble. And then Isaac's children, right? Jacob and Esau, they did the same thing, right? Joseph's children, Jacob's children, right? Didn't much care for Joseph, Daddy's favorite. Right? So this kind of thing has gone on forever and probably will go on forever until Jesus comes back. So, a couple of things in here just of note. That 931, I'll give you the brief timeline and we'll kind of back up. 931 is when this division happens. Okay? Solomon dies. And now you're having the kingdom divide in two. Basically, his children and some of the generals are kind of fighting and vying for power in this kind of thing. Now, the northern 10 tribes, the larger one, this one's called Israel. And I think in the handout I gave you guys, there's a map of the divided kingdom and what that looks like. Yeah, so there is one on that handout on the, what page? 32. Is that right?
Yeah.
Page 32 in the books if you have it. Okay, we have some maps here now of what this looks like. Now, so just in that book, here's a little caption. Let me read it to you. It says, after King Solomon's death, the civil war divided the kingdom into two parts. Israel in the north, Judah in the south. While some of the kings sought God and listened to the warnings of the prophets, many led their people into violence and idolatry. So this is the section in the Bible, you get some in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, where you get this, and this is where such and such became king over Israel, and he was more evil than all the other kings before him. And he reigned for this long, and then he died. And then this other king rose up, and he was even more evil than all the other ones. Okay? So, what you have there on that map, you can see the northern kingdom certainly is larger than the southern kingdom. Okay? Both in terms of number of tribes, but also geography-wise. And it kind of settles on the next page. You can kind of, no, I don't think that's the next page, sorry. You can kind of see again, the northern part of this is called Israel. So they keep that same name. Their capital city ends up being the town of Samaria. Okay? Samaria is the capital city. So do you guys see where Samaria is on the map? Okay. So, it's pretty much due north of Jerusalem. Okay? Now, notice Jerusalem is now in the southern kingdom called Judah, named after Judah, right? So, Judah now, its capital remains in Jerusalem. Okay? But where is the temple? Where are the people of God supposed to go and offer sacrifices?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Which kingdom is Jerusalem in?
Judah.
Judah. Okay, so what do you think the northern kingdom thinks about that?
They don't want allegiances to the southern.
Right, so they don't like it very much,
They're in Bethel.
right? Yeah. So, the northern kingdom, without getting into too many details, does a whole bunch of bad things. Okay? One, they say, Jerusalem's down there, we aren't going down there for whatever reason, some of them probably valid and some of them not, right? Says we're just going to set up our own temple and our own altar, right? And so Shiloh, you guys see the city of Shiloh, kind of in between Samaria and Jerusalem. Shiloh is another high place, so it's up on a mountain. And they build an altar and they start doing some sacrifices there and that kind of thing. Now, God doesn't like that much because God doesn't authorize, basically, and say this is how you're supposed to do things. Right? So, but the northern kingdom ends up falling into idolatry a lot more often than the southern ones. Now, they both do. They both do some pretty bad things. But partly because they don't have the center of worship of the God of Israel there, that they start trying to create their own, but they can't ever do it right. More often than not, what they do is they start to take some of the pagan gods and the pagan rituals of the surrounding cultures, especially because they didn't get rid of all of the Canaanites during Joshua's time in the conquest. And so now you have these people, these holdover from the Canaanites going, you don't really need to go down to Jerusalem. You know, let me show you how we used to do it when we didn't have Jerusalem. And so they started incorporating a lot of these pagan rituals. Now there's big ones that we hear about a lot. Baal, or Baal, or in Hebrew, Baal. Okay? Would be how you say it. That's a big Canaanite god that they start to worship, and it starts almost innocent, but it certainly isn't. Where they just said, hey, these are really kind of the same gods. We're just calling them by a different name. Right? And so this is called syncretism. Okay? Where you're starting to sync up these different things. So it starts off just saying, oh, we can just call them by a different name. We could just use these places of sacrifice and worship for these other gods, and we'll just kind of incorporate them into ourselves, right, in what we do. Problem is, more often than not, that doesn't work, right? And rather than bringing that into the real faith, into real worship, it ends up introducing pagan practices and pagan beliefs, and ends up leading the people of God into some pretty scary things and scary places. So you see that a lot in the northern kingdom, and not as much in the southern kingdom, in part just because of geography and where Jerusalem is. Now, a couple of things of note here about this. The kingdom that ruled in the northern 10 tribes, they saw a number of dynasties. Right? So it would be a king and then his son, and then they would get overthrown and somebody else would take the throne. So you saw a number of dynasties throughout this time. The southern kingdom of Judah had only one. That was the dynasty of David and Solomon. Right? So that was always passing down through the line of David. Okay? Now this becomes important because of Jesus and the Messiah. Right? So that Jesus who is Jesus descendant? David, right? So he is in this kingly dynasty. sense of David, right? But now he's a greater David, right? And a greater king with a greater kingdom. So you have this kind of thing, and we see this especially when we look at the genealogies, how the family of Jesus gets traced through David, right? And then through some of these other kings and then down through history. So you see how God is preserving, even among this kind of turmoil, God is preserving this line, this seed of Abraham, right? Going all the way down through up into Jesus. Okay? So, just a couple of other little things here to complicate matters of dating a little bit. When you go through and you read 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, there's a lot of overlap, a lot of repeated information in there. Okay, there's some that are unique to each of them, but we come across some different dates and way of dating things. Now, again, we've talked a little bit about this before, right? When do you start? So most of the time things are dated, especially when you get to Kings and Chronicles, by the number of years that a king reigns. So do you start in the year that they start, or do you start the year after they start? Right? So are you starting in year 0 or year 1? Okay. Now to complicate things a little bit more, the Northern Kingdom at times changed the beginning of their calendar year to the fall rather than to the spring. So now when you go through the Bible and you're like, and this happens sometimes when you read one account in Kings and one account in Chronicles, where the dates, you're like, well, these don't match up. What's going on? Well, if one is starting their year basically in March or April, and the other is in August and September, right? And then those things then don't always match up, especially if sometimes you're counting the year of the king's reign starting at 1 and sometimes it's starting at 0. Right? So that complicates things. Very rarely in any kind of history books, biblical history books, do you ever see this sort of thing. But sometimes you'll see a little T after one of the after a date, which means it's the Tishri date, which means it starts in the month of Tishri, which is the fall, rather than starting in what you would see a little N, which would be Nisan, which would be the beginning of the year, or which would be in the spring time for us. Then, of course, you have translated into our modern way of counting things, which can get even more complicated. Okay, so that's also why a lot of the times when you see dates in different books and things, sometimes there'll be kind of a slash. So for one of the common ones, which I'm going to debunk a little bit, is the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. Sometimes you'll see it written 587/586. Okay, so part of what that is doing is, in our way of counting, it happens sometime in those 2 years, but it's going to depend on how you're counting, which calendar you're using, and that sort of thing. Okay, so we don't always have this standardized thing, right? Even in the Bible. So that complicates some of those things here. Now, that makes it also pretty difficult at times to reconstruct the chronology of what happens during this time period. What we end up knowing becomes very helpful are by the prophets, because most of the prophetic books in the Old Testament are taking place during this time of the divided kingdom and then right afterwards. Okay? So, most of these, I think of Isaiah, most of the time when Isaiah is prophesying, he'll say in the such and such year of such and such king of Israel, Isaiah received this or vision or whatever prophecy and said this, right? So that helps us pinpoint specific times and helps us find these kinds of dates. But we also have some pretty big and important dates which become which help us to date when things happen and how things happen and why. Okay. Now the biggest thing here for us today is. But again, we're gonna kind of fast forward through some of these important dates, and I want to back up and look at some of the prophets and what they're doing somewhere. Okay, but for us, the important dates for right now are 931. Right, that's when Solomon dies, when the kingdom's divided in two. Okay, now in the year 722. 722, so 210 years-ish later, right? Assyria has become a major world empire. Okay? And Assyria is north and a little bit east. Okay? Assyria, okay, becomes this major world power. Okay? Let me see if I don't think I printed off some maps. Okay, so if you turn, I think, to page 40, if you have your books, you have a little bit of a map here. I don't think I printed these ones out in the handout. We can do this next. I'll do this next time. I think it's page 40. I've got the softback one. Sometimes the numbers are a little different. But what it looks like, it says at the beginning, the Assyrian Empire. Right? So the Assyrian Empire is north, and it's huge. I mean, in the ancient world, this is a huge, huge empire. Okay? So it's north, and basically it covers a lot of the area of modern-day Syria, Turkey, and Iraq, and part of Iran. Okay? Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. Okay? So, geography-wise, the big thing to remember about this area, this is again called one of the breadbaskets of the ancient world, okay, where things grew in abundance. So, in the western part of the world, you have two big ones, really. You have this area that is fed from, you have the Persian Gulf, but then you have the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Okay, this is called the Fertile Crescent because it's in the shape of a crescent and it's fertile. Okay? So agriculture, that kind of thing can go very well. The other is in Egypt along the Nile River. Okay? So that's part of why Egypt becomes such a major world power for thousands of years, is because they're right next to this gigantic river. So they could farm, they could travel, they could trade. Okay? Now, so the Assyrian Empire basically follows the Tigris and the Euphrates from the Persian Gulf all the way up to over to the Mediterranean Sea and almost to the Caspian Sea. And so this is a huge, huge big deal. Now the Assyrians are important for several reasons, but in the year 722, that's when they conquer, they wipe out the northern 10 tribes, the northern kingdom of Israel. Now Assyria, for our purposes, are important for a couple things. The Assyrians invented crucifixion. The Assyrians invented crucifixion as a form of punishment. By the time the Romans got a hold of it, they perfected it. Right? To keep somebody alive as long as possible. Right? So Assyrians were the ones who did this. Now, when Assyrians went in and conquered an area, what they did is they mixed up and mingled cultures all together. Okay? So you would kill a bunch of people, but they would force intermarriages, and they would move small populations around different places. Okay? And so what this does is it's harder to revolt if you can't speak the language of any of your neighbors. Right? And you have different cultures, and you're worshiping different gods, and you're doing all these different things, right? So they mix and mingle everything up. Now, So they do this, so the 10 tribes, northern 10 tribes, sometimes now get called the lost 10 tribes of Israel, right? Because we don't know what happens to them. Okay? They get intermingled with other peoples and other cultures and kind of spread things around. Now, we're going to fast forward to Jesus'
No
time.
simulation.
Or first, yes.
Can I say something? The book, this is not one of these books, it's something I've had for a while. It said the maximum extent of the Assyrian kingdom actually contained that other breadbasket, the Nile, which
Yeah.
I thought was really fascinating. So at one point, they controlled both.
Yeah, they come all the way down, they come all the way, end up coming all the way down into Egypt. Yeah. So they end up in the northern part of Egypt as well. They don't get very far down.
It looks really narrow
Yeah.
in this book.
Right.
Like just the Nile.
Right. So that's called Lower Egypt, even though it's in the north. That's called Lower Egypt because the Nile runs that way. It runs from south to north, right? And so they do upper in our minds, upper would be south because that's the upper part of the river. Okay, so Assyrians come and they mingle, they mix things up, huge world power, okay? The 10 tribes of Israel get all mingled, they get mixed, they lose their culture, some of their language, that sort of thing. Fast forward to Jesus' time, okay? This is now why Jews, during Jesus' time, despise these Samaritans. Because the Samaritans are half-breed, mingled with all these other cultures. Some of these that were able to remain there said, no, we're still kind of remain our, we're going to try to keep our culture, try to keep our religion. It doesn't really work all that well because they mix it with all of these other Assyrian cultures and religions that get brought in. Right? So Jews now are like, we're the true ethnic, we're the real ones. Right? You guys aren't. And then Jesus comes up and he finds more faith in the Samaritans than he does in the Judeans, right? So that's part of why when you get to Jesus' time again, the Jews don't like the Samaritans and why they're treated the way they are is because of this. Now remember, that's 700 years. That's a long. Our country is 700 years old. I mean, we can't even put that in, our American context very well, right? So, so that's part of what's going on here. Now, so again, that's in the year 722. So now, after that, you just have the southern kingdom. Okay? Now, the southern kingdom lasts just for about another 100 years. Okay? So you can imagine there's a little bit of gloating on their part. Hey, look, we remained independent. The Assyrians didn't conquer us, right? Ha, ha, ha. And then a couple generations later, boom, they're wiped out in a way that's different. Now, one of the big things when you go through and you read the prophets, during this time of the threat of the Assyrians, one of the big places God's people, they want to run and they're like, we need some help. Who are we going to get help from?
Egypt.
So we're going to go down to Egypt and get help from Egypt. And God says, no, don't go there. I just delivered you out of that place. So now you're going to run back over there for help? If you just believe in me, if you turn back and you repent and you believe and do things the right way, I'll deliver you. They said, no, God, we think we know better. And then it doesn't turn out so well. Right? Now, okay, Assyria grows and grows and grows, and then the Babylonian Empire rises up. And this is really what's called the Neo-Babylonian Empire. There was another one before, several hundred years earlier, much smaller. Okay? But now you have the Babylonian Empire. So, if you have the books, it was on that same page, or the next page. In the softbound one is page 42, where you see the Babylonian Empire. Okay? So the Assyrian Empire lasts for 300 years, 912 to 612. So quite a while, right? Yeah. The Babylonians start in the year 612, and the Babylonians, they start to grow. They don't really last all that long, okay? They only last a couple of generations, really, to about the year 539. But in 612 is when the Babylonians come up, and you have the first big Babylonian king named what? Nebuchadnezzar, right? So one of the things that Nebuchadnezzar does is he now comes over into this little bitty country now of Judah that the Assyrians hadn't swallowed up yet. And he comes over, and in the year 605, he basically sacks Jerusalem. And when he does this, the Babylonians have a very different tactic. Rather than mixing and mingling everything up, they're going to take entire populations and move them. Okay? So he comes into the year 605, and the first thing that he does is they kill all the leaders, and then they take all of the young promising men and they import them back to Babylon to train and to learn the ways and that kind of thing, in the hopes of now saying, we're going to take the best and brightest of all these different cultures and we're going to make it ours. Right? So, there's 4 people of note in the Bible that it takes. Okay? Big one is Daniel, right? And then you have the Babylonian names, which, interestingly enough, even though it says in the book of Daniel, we don't remember, or I've rarely met anybody that actually remembers the Jewish names. But we remember their Babylonian names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Right? Okay. So, these are young men that in 605, the Babylonians come, they sack the town, kill the leaders, put up kind of a puppet governor, and they take all the promising young men back to Babylon. Okay? Now, so this is kind of when part of the Babylonian exile starts, although it goes a little bit later. So there's more waves of this. Okay? And that the last wave ends in the year 587. And in 587, the Babylonians come in and they basically flatten the entire city of Jerusalem. They burn it all down to the ground.
Babylon's a little bit different than some of the other empires, though, because God specifically sent them and told them, like Jeremiah.
Right. Okay.
I mean, they said, your God sent me to conquer you.
Right. Right. So, you see a little bit, you see God using Assyria in a similar way, but not to the same extent. Right? So that people knew, I mean, when you go through and you read the prophets, you know for a fact that that Assyria is God's punishment on the northern kingdom. Okay? Babylon is even more so, because you have this passage in Jeremiah, but as well, where now the Babylonians are saying, hey, your God's the one who sent me here to conquer you, because you guys aren't doing things right. If you were, right, this wouldn't be happening. So Babylon comes in the year 587 on April 21st, 10 days from now. April 21st. Big world events happen in April. You guys didn't know that. When you go through the history of the world, April, more major world events happen in April than any other month. You know why?
It's the weather.
Because of the weather, yeah. Especially in the northern hemisphere, because that's when armies didn't fight in the winter, right?
No.
And that has been the case up through World War II. How well did it work out for Germany invading Russia in the winter? That
Not as
didn't,
well as it did for Napoleon.
right? That didn't work. Yeah. So, So, 587, April 21st, Babylonians come in, flatten the town, destroy the temple, everything's gone. They basically now pick up the vast majority of the population of the people and they move it right into Babylon. And then Babylon moves peoples from other cultures and says, hey, if you want to rebuild, go away. Right? So, this happens. Now, 70 years they're in Babylon. Right? And we see this, again, prophesied about and talked about. So they're in Babylon for 70 years. And then the Babylonian Empire falls, and the Persian Empire takes its place. The Persian emperor, the first one, his name is, you remember? Cyrus. Yeah. Isaiah talks about Cyrus decades before Cyrus is even around and born. And says this King Cyrus is going to come in, and in a similar way, Cyrus says, your God now said that I can let you go. Right? And so Cyrus then allows the people of God to go back to Jerusalem. Now, some of them do, big population do. Some of them don't. Okay? And what you're starting to see, this is all at this time, another fancy name for this is called the diaspora, right? The dispersion. So a bunch of people stayed. Now, because you have these big empires that are going around, during this time of the Babylonian exile as well, this is in the temples destroyed. This is where you start to see basically the invention and the rise of the synagogue. So how are people supposed to worship and do things if they can't go to Jerusalem? So you have synagogue worship that begins at this time. As people go home, again, not everybody does that. Some stay. And you're starting to get even more of a dispersed population of Jews, but that are able to retain some bit of their identity in a way that wasn't possible with the upper kingdom of Israel as they were intermingled were to, because the Babylonians and the Persians let them retain their culture and their identity and their family. Okay? So around this time then, you have, right after this is when you get the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, as the people come back and they go, oh, there's other people living here. What do we do? Right? They want to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. Okay? And that ends up becoming an issue, because part of that is, just like in any ancient city, hey, we want to build a wall to protect us. And people are saying, oh no, you don't want to trust these Judeans because they're pretty rebellious. And if they do this, they're going to try to break away and become independent, which they kind of do later on. But Ezra and Nehemiah, you get a bunch of the history of what happens as people come back. Now, also during some of this time, backing up just a little, and this is kind of where we're going to end, and we'll go a little bit, we'll go a little bit more here. So they're led back in the year 538. Okay? 538, Cyrus allows them to come back home. A couple years later, they start to rebuild Jerusalem. And then it's about another 20 years before they start to rebuild the temple. Now, as they do this, they also are rediscovering the Bible, basically, in the Old Testament. Because they get there, if you remember, they find, as they're going through rubble and stuff, they're like, oh, hey, here's this book. And they open it up, and it's the books that Moses have read. And they start reading through it, and they're like, oh, we've forgotten a bunch of this stuff. Right? And so you have, in essence, this whole revival after a rediscovery of God's Word. Okay? So they start to rebuild the temple. Now, fast forwarding in time a little bit, you get around the years 483 to 473. Okay? So this is, 70, 60 years, 50 years after they can go back. Again, you have these populations and pockets of people who don't. There's this one faithful Jewish man named Mordecai and his family who don't. Okay? And he has a relative, right? A daughter? A niece. Yeah. I always get that mistake. A niece. Yeah. Named what? Esther. Right? Now, so you have Esther. So you have that whole book that takes place during this time period as well. Now, a little bit later on, again, you have some more things on Ezra and Nehemiah and things that go in here. And then around the year 450, okay, around the year 450 is when Malachi is written, and that's the last book of the Old Testament. Okay, so 450-ish is when Malachi starts to write, and then things, the Old Testament's done. Okay, so real quick, in that handout that I gave you as well, if you turn some of the pages here. If you don't have it or the book, that's perfectly fine. I think I gave another handout on this as well on when the different books of the Bible were written.
Yeah, you did.
Right? Yep. So this is a similar thing. In the softbound book, you have on page 34 and 35 anyway, you have a list of the kings. I want to first look at that. A list of the kings in the two kingdoms. Okay? Did you find that?
Yep.
Okay. One page is Kings of Israel, another one's the Kings of Judah. Anyway, you guys can look at this later if you want, the dates, the scripture even, readings and where that matches up. The Kings of Israel, look down the evaluation from Jeroboam. Did evil, did evil, did evil, did evil, did evil, all the way down. Right? Yeah. They're bad. Okay? Now, you have the Kings of Judah around the same time here, right? And you have the cause of death too, right? Jeroboam, struck down by God, right? That's not good. Nadab, killed by Baasha, right? Then natural causes, killed by Zimri, suicide, natural causes, fatally wounded. Very few of them actually die of natural causes. Most of them are killed, right? Now, in Judah, they're not much better. Okay? So you have starting with Rehoboam, did evil, did right, did evil, did evil, did evil, did right, did evil, did right, did evil. Okay, now, how do you think the religious community throughout this time period is handling things? When you have a king that reigns for 20 years that does a pretty good job, and then the next 3 that are evil. And then you have 1 or 2 that do a good job, and then you have 3 more that are evil. Right? It's kind of hard to stay faithful when you have your leadership of a country going back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth all the time. And even the ones that are good, some of them are good, are kind of, they're not that good. But even if they are that good, they aren't able to enact and do the reforms that they want to, because the following one comes and reverses everything that the previous leader did. Okay.
Or there's just too much to reform, and for whatever reason they don't follow through on it.
Yep. Okay, now, one of the pages on the handouts, and then in the book, it's a couple pages later, you have the prophets. So you have a similar list, okay, of these prophets. So these are also going to match up then with the different books that they write, the prophetic books. Okay, starting with Samuel. Okay, so Samuel is kind of this transitionary figure at the end of the time of the judges into the monarchy, right? And then this goes down to Malachi and Joel. Okay, Joel is put last because we're not really sure when. Okay, when Joel is speaking. But Malachi, we know, is the last one in the 400s, probably 450 to 430, 425, somewhere in that time period is when he's doing this. Also in these lists, both the first one I gave you as well as the second one, or this one from the book, it shows a little bit of the location on where they are and where they're preaching to. Some to the northern kingdom, some to the southern, some to both. Okay. Now, real quick, just to put some. Lastly, to put some things into some broader world history and context here. While these things are taking place, a couple of things. In the 1100s, maybe around the year 1200, is when the Trojan War supposedly happened. Okay, so this is the time of the judges. Before Saul, right, and the kings. So you have the Trojan War. Now Homer lives sometime around the year, kind of a traditional dating, around the year 850. 850. Okay, so by this time the two kingdoms are divided, but they're both still in existence. Right? So this is when Homer is around doing things. The first Olympic Games were held in 775. Okay, 775 BC. Okay, so 722 is when Assyria wipes out the northern kingdom. So they're both there. Okay, 753 in April, okay, is when Rome is founded. Okay. You guys know the story and the legend of how Rome gets founded? With Romulus and Remus, and nursed by a wolf. Yeah. Fun thing. So, okay, so that's some of the things that are happening here. You have some more of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Right, one of the 7 great wonders of the world. During the height of the Babylonian Empire is when that's there. You're starting to get what's called step pyramids are becoming a little more popular and common in Assyria and a little bit in Babylon as well. So we have some of that kind of stuff that is going on at the same time. Okay, around the year. Around the year 600, Babylon tries to get down into Egypt, and the Egyptians block them and don't let them go in. Around this time as well, the Greeks start to go over into Spain. So now they're crossing the Mediterranean and they're branching out in both directions. Okay, so they start to get over there in Spain. Greece is starting, and this is really what we're going to talk about more. Greece, things with Sparta and Athens, these things are starting to rise with the great city-states at this time. Most notably, again, we'll pick up here next time, with the Persian Empire, who tries to creep down and conquer Greece. Okay? And they're met by the 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae, and they're defeated at the Battle of Marathon. And as a result, this kind of thing lays the groundwork and the framework for Greece to be united in a little bit more of a way, which then leads to Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire. Okay, so that's kind of where we'll pick up next time. It's talking a little bit about this transition period after the Persians, and some of this will be the intertestamental time period in history. So we'll probably take a couple of weeks to look at that because we want to look at some of the Apocrypha and that sort of things as well. Okay? All right, we're past time. We got to pray and get going. So, yeah, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together today. And again, as we see your hand and your salvation working throughout your creation. So grant us that same salvation, deliver us from that same sin, and bring us at last to that eternal heavenly kingdom. In Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.